very important VIPs during the last months, and nobody was ever coming on the third Wednesday of the month. So we keep the schedule for 2 years, but now we are a little bit going to freestyle dates. I guess that on the third week of September we will have a very small meetup, very small, relaxing, quiet meetup, and then there is the month of Scaling Bitcoin. Scaling Bitcoin will be, as you know, a closed technical event, but we may follow up the next week with a meetup where we can also tell you what's going on, what happened in the week following scaling, so after 8 and 9 of October. This is our actually 34th monthly meetup. As in the last 10, I guess, we have our completely trust-based, centralized blockchain lottery. So, if you want the chance to win a Ledger hardware wallet, kindly sponsored by the Rock Trading Bitcoin exchange, the wallet is somewhere here. You have to trust me that there is. No, okay, we don't have to show it. So there is a QR code on the walls. The QR code doesn't bring you anymore just to the Eternity World website. Francesco managed to create another with a WordPress add-on. There is a website where you can directly generate an address. The website has this add-on. Just keep the public master key and generate the address on the fly. You will pay there. There is a minimum value to pay, and then at I would say 9. This is the 9. What do you do? 9:30. Yeah, at 9:30 Italian time, we will select the first block. We will compare the ID of the block with the ID of the transactions that we received, and the closer ID, numerically speaking, will win with the proof of payment. Will win the Ledger wallet. So you can, yeah, exactly. Yeah, do it. Just this is our example girl. No. This is Gabriele Domenichini, the president of Assobit. So I can leave the microphone to our guest. This time our guest is coming from the US and from one of the is coming. Who said he's coming? He's coming from the US, one of the main companies in the Bitcoin space, Blockstream. And he is one of the main contributors to the project, and he will give us a presentation. And his name, I guess many of you know his name, and his look is Matt Corallo. Thank you very much.
I swear this went earlier.
Yeah, let's get dance in the meantime. Okay. If you keep too much suspense between words, the music will stop.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll make sure to keep talking.
Yeah.
Yeah, so admittedly, I didn't really know what I wanted to talk about tonight. So I figured I'd talk about some stuff that I've been working on for quite a while, which is general high-speed relay, improving network latency and block relay around the Bitcoin network and between pools and FDUs, primarily between pools and miners. Yeah, so I'll try to speak at a reasonable pace. If I speed up and become hard to understand, please throw something at me or interrupt me. I don't mind. I know foreign languages are incredibly hard, so I'll try to keep it reasonably understandable. Yeah, so I've been involved in Bitcoin at some level for I guess 5 years, maybe a bit more now, and kind of got started working on block relay and block relay technology in very late 2013, kind of November, December, when there are a number of kind of concerns about block relay that were coming up. And I'll dive into those quite a bit, kind of cover what those concerns were, kind of where those concerns have evolved, what those concerns are today, and just kind of the intricate effects of how block relay affects any number of facets of decentralization of Bitcoin. And then I'll talk a bit more about the technology that I've been developing and others have been developing to improve block relay, both across the peer-to-peer network and on private networks. Yeah, so I mean, just general background, let's start with the peer-to-peer network. It is theoretically random, it was designed to have completely random connections, something that looks a bit like this. So this is actually a map that was created by some researchers a number of years ago. Their methodology was pretty flawed, so this is mostly not representative, but it's close, right? I mean, you can see just a bunch of almost random connections. Most nodes by default have completely random connections, and then there's a few nodes that do ridiculous, crazy things. If you've ever actually dealt with a peer-to-peer network or written a node or connected to random nodes on the network, I'm sure you've seen nodes that act in ridiculous ways and do really stupid things, but for the most part, it's completely random and a complete mess. So this, let's try to stand over here, so I'm not always in the way. So, I mean, it's completely random because there's kind of a few goals of the peer-to-peer network, right? Ideally, the peer-to-peer network would be three things. It would maximize decentralization, so you'd have the ability to always connect, and there wouldn't be any kind of central points of failure. It would be incredibly reliable, so you don't really have to worry about missing blocks, or not getting access to blocks or transactions, or your transactions not propagating. And it would also be fast, right? Block relay speed is important, and we'll get into a lot why in this talk. But ideally, things will relay around the peer-to-peer network quickly. As it turns out, optimizing all three of those is incredibly difficult. Making things decentralized and making things fast is almost incompatible, because when your network looks like this, and you want a block to get from here to everywhere else on the network, as it turns out, a random book of connections between random nodes is not really the most efficient routing to go around the world 5 times before you get to the node you're going to, before you get to all miners, right? So it's very hard to optimize for all three of these, and in general, the Bitcoin peer-to-peer network has been optimized primarily for decentralization and reliability, and not always speed. Because as long as obviously it's more important for Bitcoin to continue to work and to be decentralized than it is for the peer-to-peer network to necessarily be the fastest thing in the world. Within that, right, like we have this peer-to-peer network of connecting to random nodes that you don't trust. As it turns out, Bitcoin data is very self-validating. It has things like a fork on blocks, which you can validate before you relay. It has signatures on virtually all of the data that you relay. So we can validate all of that data before we relay it along, which is what any reasonable security professional would tell you to do. Validate your data in every way you possibly can before you accept it or do any processing on it. But of course, this is slow. So again, we're optimizing for decentralization and reliability and security, and optimizing a bit less for speed. Still, this peer-to-peer network of complete random gobbledygook everywhere is complex. I mean, Bitcoin's a complex system, Bitcoin Core is a complex piece of machinery, and there are many angles of attacks to the peer-to-peer network in general. Anything from general DOS attacks, right? If you take a lot of nodes offline, there's going to be fewer connections, and things might not relay as quickly. If you're wasting a bunch of people's bandwidth, their nodes aren't as well connected, things aren't going to relay as quickly. Hopefully they'll still be really reliable because that's where a lot of the work has been put in, but speed will suffer. Additionally, I mean, you have concerns like network messages, which might split the network. So a lot of the review effort, I mean, I was talking to Peter earlier, and he said that most of the time when he sees any pull request or any attempts to change the code that touches the peer-to-peer network or the network implementation of Bitcoin Core, the first and kind of most important thing you review it for, beyond security and functionality, is that there is no chance that it can possibly split the network. So there's no message that you might send that will cause an old version to no longer connect to new versions, or that will cause nodes to disconnect each other, so that the network remains well connected and reliable. At the time, kind of when I got started with all of this stuff, in really late 2013, there was a wonderful crash of Bitcoin Core. I don't know how many of you remember this. In 0.8.4, this was fixed. The bug was entirely my fault. You're welcome. But there was a divide by zero, so you could remotely send a message to a node and it will immediately crash. Not major security implications, but very significant reliability implications, which can cause people to lose money. But we're not aware of anyone ever exploiting this, so maybe it's fine. So in any case, right, the peer-to-peer network is a really complex piece of machinery, and a lot of effort has gone into making sure that it's reliable and that connections will remain well connected across each other. But oftentimes this results in somewhat worse, or at least not focusing on speed of transactions relaying around the network, and more importantly, blocks relaying around the network. So this creates a problem for miners, right? If a miner is working on work and hasn't seen a new block, then the work that they're currently putting into their block might go wasted because there's already another block that other people are going to accept, and any block they find will just be an orphan, will just be thrown away, which can cause significant costs to miners, even a few percent for some pool. Like if your pool charges a 3% fee and you have a 1% orphan rate, and you eat the orphan costs like many pools do today, there goes a third of your profit margin. So all of these kind of speed issues are a major problem for many miners. So that's the peer-to-peer network and kind of a bit of background about where the optimization work goes in there. But let's talk for a moment about the selfish mining attack. So again, back in late 2013, when I first got really excited about a lot of relay technology, this was at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. So the selfish mining attack was first published in a paper, I think around that time. I don't have the exact date. But around that time, some researchers published a paper on a strategy for a miner to withhold blocks where they could, quote unquote, act greedily. They act, they're greedy, and they do something other than what the protocol necessarily indicates they would do, and they will get more blocks than their hash power implies. It's important to note, and this is a common misconception with selfish mining, that selfish mining, although you can, with, say, 40% hash power, get more than 50% of the total Bitcoin blocks, this is not equivalent to a 51% attack. Because a 51% attack, you get all of the blocks at 50-something% hash power, whereas with a selfish mining attack, you will never be able to achieve all of the blocks, unless, of course, you have 51% hash power, but you will get more than your fair share. So you will increase your profit margin, or you increase your profit at the cost of others, which is a major attack on Bitcoin. It's a major attack on the ability of mining to remain decentralized, because it's more expensive for your competitors, they don't make as much as you, but it doesn't allow you to do a 51% attack, as some people seem to think. So, what is selfish mining? Selfish mining, the strategy for what you do, essentially we have, we start here, right? So we start at block 1, there's a blockchain, it leads up to block 1. Now, Bob, this evil miner, Bob finds block N here, and Bob doesn't announce it. Yeah, right. So Bob doesn't announce block N. Bob keeps block N to themselves. They have a bunch of their own servers around the globe where they distribute block N so that their servers are ready to go. They're aware of block N, but they don't tell anyone else yet. So this means that, or I guess that's n prime, sorry, n prime. This means that the rest of the network, so all of the other miners everywhere, are still mining block n here. So they haven't found this yet. This block exists and they're still mining this guy. So what happens when some other miner somewhere finds block n? Well, they announce it, and if Bob is smart, Bob will have better technology and will find out about this block n before it has necessarily gone out to the entire peer-to-peer network, right? So the peer-to-peer network is this crazy mess, and Alice, someone over here, they find block n, and Bob already has a bunch of nodes all over the place that have n+1, but they haven't told anyone else. And Bob's this node here, let's say that's the one connected here. Alice, the honest miner, finds a new block, announces it to Bob, and then Bob immediately announces his block to everyone else on the network. And all of a sudden, everyone else on the network sees Bob's block before Alice's block. So everyone else sees this block before this block, and immediately they say, okay, I'm gonna mine here, and not on top of this. Which means this block is now useless, right? Now everyone's ignoring this block, or at least most people are ignoring this block. And Bob's block has won the race, which means all of the work that went in to finding this block has been completely wasted. So what this means in effect is that while Bob will increase his orphan rate, because sometimes he won't win the race, sometimes this block will actually get out and he will lose, but Bob's orphan rate will go up way less than the rest of the network, and Bob, on average, makes more money, at least after the difficulty adjusts. Any questions on that? That was kind of moving forward pretty quick, but hard with the diagram.
I will ask, Bob is already starting to mining on his block
sure.
before.
So yeah, Bob's already mining on the next block, and might in fact find another block and be 2 blocks ahead of the rest of the network before the rest of the network finds this block.
So why would anyone start to mine on Alice's block when Bob has 2? I mean,
can you use the microphone, please?
Oh, sorry.
Why would anyone mine on Alice's block, which has a length n-1 compared to Bob?
Yeah. So remember, Bob has not announced any of his blocks. So Bob's finding these blocks down here, but hasn't told anyone else about them. So it's impossible for anyone else to mine on them except for Bob. So while the rest of the network is forced to go off and mine on blocks, which hopefully, or at least Bob hopes, will be thrown away eventually.
No, I was saying Alice finds a block, and then immediately Bob's broadcasts is 2 blocks, which means his chain is longer by 1. Why would anyone be still mining on Alice? Unless they haven't seen the second block from Bob.
Yeah, they would. They would, which means Bob has now convinced Alice to waste a bunch of her hash power, and Bob has wasted less of his. Hasn't wasted any in this case, but randomly will waste some. So, in the selfish mining paper, and kind of in discussion about selfish mining, there's this 33% threshold. 33% is the threshold at which it always makes sense to be doing this attack with some assumptions. Because of the way the attack works, you have to assume constant hash power, and you're essentially pushing profits that you will make in the future, or giving up profits now to make more profit in the future. So there's some assumptions, but in a stable system, 33% is the hash power you would need to always want to perform this attack. So a lot of people just call it the 33% attack, and they don't. And there's been a lot of kind of ignoring the rest of the detail. As it turns out, what this threshold is can be much lower depending on this parameter gamma. So in the original paper, they had this parameter gamma, and in fact, this is a graph from the original paper that shows at what percent it makes sense to do this strategy. So down here, it's your pool size. So what percentage of the total network your pool is. This is 10, 20, 30, 50%. And up here is the relative pool revenue. So what percentage of blocks you find. So obviously when your pool has 50% of the total network hash rate, Well, you get 100% of the blocks because you perform a 51%. Makes sense. Obviously, at 0 hash rate, you're always going to get 0 blocks. And this straight line here is the kind of what you should get if you're mining honestly, right? You start from 0, and it just increases linearly with your hash rate. Down here, so there's actually 3 different lines here, depending on gamma, depending on this parameter. At the bottom is if you have no relay advantage. So when you find a block, or when Alice announces her block, Alice will always have announced her block to the entire peer-to-peer network, or at least the entire network of miners, before you can announce your block. So you always lose the race. If you always lose the race, then it makes sense to start selfish mining at 33%. So this is where selfish mining is now more profitable than the naive and honest mining. However, if you win the race more often, that threshold decreases and can decrease rapidly. So the stop line is, in fact, if you always win the race. So if you have perfect knowledge of the peer-to-peer network, or at least where other miners are in the peer-to-peer network, and you have perfect knowledge of when other miners find a block, you are guaranteed to always win the race, which means that the rest of the network will always mine on top of your block and will ignore Alice's because Alice was late, as far as they can tell. Then it always makes sense to perform this strategy. And you can always get more profit than you necessarily should as an honest miner. And for obvious reason, this is very bad for the network, right? You all of a sudden are making more profit than your competitors because of your better technology, and this hurts decentralization because mining is no longer an easy industry to get into. You have to spend a lot of time understanding the peer-to-peer network, understanding how it works, and understanding how to analyze it, and how to perform this attack. So, yeah, this is kind of general overview of the selfish mining attack, and one of the reasons I got into working on fast relay. Obviously, you know, if we can improve make it harder for people to improve gamma, and make it so that it's very hard to get past 0, then it becomes much harder to perform this attack. So I'm going to jump a tiny bit ahead. Up until now, I've kind of been discussing what things were like in late 2013, kind of right at the beginning of 2014, and talk about empty blocks and validationless mining, which is something that I think a lot of people are more aware of today, because it's something that we've seen a lot of in the last year and a half. So empty blocks and validationless mining came about primarily because of a different payout scheme for pools. Primarily in China, but also now to some extent outside of China, it is absolutely a market requirement if you're running a pool to use the payout scheme pay per share. So pay per share essentially means when someone is mining on your pool and they find 1 share, so you know a millionth of a difficulty block or something like that, you will pay out exactly what that share's expected value is. So if I find a share that is a millionth of the difficulty of a block, they will pay out a millionth of the value of a block, always, and ignore the orphan costs. So this changes the incentive structure for mining a lot, because pools are now eat the orphan costs. And I kind of mentioned this earlier, but if you're a pool and you charge a 3% fee, and you have an orphan rate of 1%, and you eat the orphan rate cost, there goes a third of your profit, and that's major. So all of a sudden, this pay-per-share model, which the market expects in China and to some extent now in the West, means that you, the pool operator, need to minimize orphans at all costs. It is the biggest effect on your bottom line, which means it is the thing you focus on day in, day out. The solution to this was validationless mining. The solution to this is that you connect to other pools. You connect to their Stratum server, which is just the communication protocol that pools use to talk to miners, or pools use to talk to hashers. And when another pool announces a new block, announces a change to the block they're working on, other pools will immediately switch and start mining based on that. They have no ability to validate this data, all they see is a block hash. They see, well, they see what they're told is a block hash. It can be any random hash, it can be any random string of digits, and they will immediately start mining on that as if it were a block. They don't have the block, they've never seen the block, they've never seen the header, they have no proof that it even exists, let alone has a valid proof of work. But this makes sense if you have to minimize your orphan rate, and that is the thing you have to focus on. Well, you know, trusting them a bit, you can come back from a few block loss, but a few percent increase in orphan rate means the end of your business. So, if one pool can announce a change in the block they're working on, and all the other pools immediately switch to that without validating anything or without knowing anything about it, this effectively makes them one pool. If one pool decides what another pool works on, from the point of view of me, someone who wants to trust that miners are validating, that's one pool to me. I don't care whether they're run by different people. I mean, one person or one server is picking what the entire set of pools is mining on. And in fact, we saw this come up. We saw a fork of several blocks because one pool generated an invalid block and a bunch of other pools mined on top of it because they had no ability to validate, they had no ability to see what was even in that block. We have some weak evidence that pools even use this to attack each other by just feeding them random garbage. And hey, they go mine on it. But again, you know, if you lose a block every week, then you can come back from it. Whereas if you increase your orphan rate by a few percent, your business is over. So, yeah, as I alluded to, this completely breaks the SPV model. Right? The SPV model can be defined, or weakly defined. Key component is that you're trusting miners to validate. Right? If you are an SPV client, you see 6 blocks, you can say that there are 6, the percentage of hash rate is likely somewhere around a large number of hash rate, or a large amount of hash rate, based on the speed of the blocks. A large amount of hash rate has committed to saying that these transactions are valid and confirmed, and they will not be undone, and you trust that as an SPV client. But all of a sudden, when you're talking about validationless mining, well, you're not trusting anything. You're trusting one guy because one guy gets to pick what all the other pools mine on. So as a result of kind of the issue where we saw this trigger a few block reorg or a few block fork, some various pools have implemented some measures to try to limit the effect of it. They limit the time on which they'll mine other blocks before having seen them. It still has the same effect that they're one pool, but all of a sudden they're just one pool for a shorter period of time than maybe they otherwise would have been, depending on how it's implemented. Obviously, this stuff is all closed source. I've never seen it. I've only been told that they limit the amount of time. They might or might not. Take that for what it's worth. So generally, it's pretty strongly agreed that this is not a great idea, but interestingly, it strongly discourages selfish mining. Remember that selfish mining increases your orphan rate, but it increases everyone else's orphan rate more. So if you are running a paper share pool, you are strongly discouraged from selfish mining. Of course, it also means that if someone else is selfish mining, you're going to get put out of business very quickly. In short, the empty blocks and validationless mining stuff, the validationless mining stuff it's a really complex system. It's not been particularly well analyzed. It's something that's a bit more new. I don't think many of the Bitcoin kind of academic folks have spent much time looking at it, and it seems questionable. For some reason, I forgot to mention that empty blocks happen because someone's validationless mining. Right? If you haven't validated or even seen the block you're mining on, there's no way for you to include transactions, so you generate empty blocks. All right, so we're going to jump back a tiny bit to late 2013. So this, I'm going to talk about kind of what I was working on at that time, and then what I continue to work on kind of through 2014. So we're, at the time, there's no known, or even now, there's no known solution to selfish mining at the protocol level. Kind of two general ways to approach selfish mining: either detect it and then have miners work together to kind of hurt the profits of the selfish miner, so they can destroy the selfish miner, which is questionable because we don't want miners to collude, but if they're colluding to beat an attacker, maybe it makes sense. But another thing that you can do generally is to try to decrease the ability of people to get a better gamma. So it always makes sense to selfish mine at 33%, but by making it harder to get more gamma, you can make it much harder to selfish mine at anything below 33%. So this is a lot of where the relay network and things like it are focused on, is decreasing the ability of someone to perform these kinds of attacks, or even just decreasing the ability of someone who is an honest miner to have better orphan rates than others by having a better network. Right? If you are a small at-home miner or someone who wants to solo mine, you should be able to have the same orphan rate as everyone else without having to invest a ton of time and energy and money into running some fancy network of nodes all over. So, how do we build a fast network to relay blocks all over the globe? Solution: centralization. There's no great way to speed up a decentralized network to the speed of light. You can obviously speed up a peer-to-peer network a lot, and this is something we'll get into a bit more because it's something that we've done a lot of work on, or a bunch of people have done a lot of work on recently. But if you want to build something that will actually reach the speed of light, your only option pretty much is to build something centralized. And I'll talk a bit more about the implications of that in this case for centralization. The impacts of centralization differs depending on what you're talking about, but that's how it starts, right? So essentially the goal of the relay network started by building a network of well-connected nodes. So this is kind of a map. So as people can see it, this is kind of a map of nodes that are all in well-connected locations with good peering between each other. If you want to know why this topology was picked, there is an explainer on the Bitcoin Fiber website. It turns out there's a lot that goes into this, and the internet is a terrible, terrible place if you want cheap, low-latency connections, because hosts optimize for how much money they have to spend and not how fast your connections are. And the second goal, the second thing that the relay network does is just send less data. So kind of the classic modeling of TCP, right? If you have a TCP connection will work at a certain speed, and the less data you send, the faster it will be. So the way we do this, right? The classic Bitcoin, classic Bitcoin protocol. It sends transactions all the time. It sends the transactions that it will that hopefully will end up in blocks all around the network. Long before we see the blocks, which means we've already seen most of the data that's going to be in the block before we see it. But up till recently, the Bitcoin protocol resent all of those transactions in the block anyway. So the goal of the relay, or one of the key features of the relay network protocol is to not do that. The way it does it is pretty naive and really simple because, keep it simple. So it uses constant memory, or a constant size list of transactions, which is limited, so effectively constant memory. A constant size list of transactions that it thinks are the most likely to be in the next block. And then when it sees a block, it just sends you the index in this list and all the transactions that weren't in the list, and then you can reconstruct the block. So you have the entire network essentially has a constant list of transactions, and when you get a block, you say, okay, the first transaction, and the fifth transaction, and the seventh transaction, and the third transaction, and here's a transaction that I didn't have, and here's the whole thing. And from that, you can pretty easily reconstruct the block, and it only takes 2 bytes per transaction that you've already seen, and in about 20% of the cases, is able to send an entire block in 2 TCP packets, which is just under 3,000 bytes. It works very well, but let's talk a bit about that centralization statement I made, right? It's a very centralized network. It's obviously centralized around me because I run it, which means I get to pick which blocks relay fast in it. I get to censor blocks. I get to decide that your block gets delayed, which is to some extent a trust system, but there are secondary systems and there are backup systems, right? Most large pools have their own centralized networks that they run for their own blocks, which are in fact even faster than the relay network because they have fancier protocols. So they're not too worried about me censoring their blocks because they already have their own network. And if I censor their blocks or slow down their blocks, their networks are going to be fast anyway. Additionally, of course, we have the peer-to-peer network. Right? Even if I decide that I don't like your block and I don't feel like relaying your block, the peer-to-peer network will relay your block, even if it'll be a bit slower, a decent margin. Your block will eventually get everywhere because, again, the peer-to-peer network's focus is reliability, and your block will get where it needs to go, which is every node. Second of all, it's important to notice that TCP is not a fucking constant bitrate stream. Everyone, this is incredibly common even in academia. This is really common for people to just assume TCP. You make a connection, and it goes at a certain speed, and you take the amount of data, you divide it by the speed of the stream, and that's how long it'll take. That's not how it works. That's a reasonable approximation if you have a lot of data to send, and for most connections, a lot of data is not all that much. It's on the order of 100 megabytes, but the data we're working with is nowhere near that. Very often blocks happen in a few thousand bytes. I mean, this is a scatter plot, right? This is 1,000 bytes, so there's a lot of blocks that take less than 1,000 bytes, which is easily in one packet. If we're talking about TCP, the individual packets start, if we're talking about data this small, individual packets start to really matter. So you can see this is a scatter plot of the amount of data it took to relay a block after it's been compressed to the number of milliseconds that it took to get all the way around the relay network. So there's obviously a strong relation between the amount of data sent and the amount of data, or the amount of time taken, but note that this is a log graph. This is a log-log graph. So both axes are log, and this straight line and this seemingly straight, very straight correlation is exponential. So TCP, definitely not constant bitrate because the relationship between the amount of data we send and the amount of time is actually exponential for small packets. Where this comes from is round trips. So the connections that I have in the relay network, again, are pretty long distance, right? We're talking about Europe to Asia and across the Pacific. So when we're talking about sending not much data across a 100 megabit or a gigabit connection, the actual act of sending that data takes very little time, whereas the time for it to transit the actual line is very significant. The internet, as most of you probably know, loses packets all the time. That's in fact one of the founding principles of the internet, and why it works is that packet delivery is best effort. Packets might not get where they need to go, but that's okay. We have a recovery mechanism. TCP detects that packets were lost and asks for them again. But when it asks for them, it has to go all the way around the globe again and wait for the thing to get over there and to come back, which, as it turns out, makes this relationship very superlinear, because when we lose a few packets, which is much more likely as we send more data, we have to wait way longer to go all the way around the globe and get that one packet that we missed again. So, what's the effect of this? This means that it strongly encourages you to put transactions in your block that matches what the relay network expects. If your block meets exactly what the relay network expects, your block is going to get transmitted around the relay network in one packet every time, and you're going to be way down here. Other miners are going to get your block really quickly, and you're going to have a lower orphan rate. This is maybe, in fact, even worse than me censoring blocks, because all of a sudden, I get to pick what transactions go in blocks. Again, there's backup networks, so this doesn't happen in practice, but if this were the only network, or if people were relying on this more, I would have the ability to censor individual transactions, or to censor individual large groups of transactions, because miners would be strongly discouraged from including them, because their blocks would take forever to relay. Yeah, so now we're caught up to kind of early 2014 and a lot of the work that went into the relay network, and let's talk about work that's happened since and work that's gone into improving the peer-to-peer network. So the peer-to-peer network, again, is a bit of a different story. I talked a bit about how the focus is a bit more on reliability than it is on speed. Of course, we want to improve speed as much as we can to limit the effects of centralized networks and to make sure that there is a decentralized option for people that is as close as we can possibly get to as fast, even if we can't get to identically as fast, because peer-to-peer is hard to optimize like that. So one of the major issues with reliability for people, and in fact a major issue for some users, discouraging them from running a full node, is bandwidth and buffer bloat. How many of you have heard the term buffer bloat? Okay, so buffer bloat refers to a general class of problems in networking that has been around since at least the 80s, maybe earlier, and networking engineers, or especially academics and high-level networking engineers, complain about it all the time. What it essentially means is the routers between you and the server that you're talking to have too large a buffer. Normally you might assume, okay, you know, if I put a packet on the network, I want it to have as large a buffer as possible to make sure I don't drop too many packets. But as it turns out, most of the protocols on the internet are heavily optimized so that when you do lose a packet, it's okay, and we use that as feedback for all kinds of important decisions. If you have a very large buffer on your routers, very large packet buffer, so packets are sitting in the router for a long period of time, this really, really confuses a lot of protocols on the internet. It confuses TCP. The most obvious implication of this that you guys might be aware of, I don't know if you remember 10 years ago, every time you turned on your freaking torrent client, the internet would stop working. And you'd yell downstairs, like, turn off your damn torrents, I just want to watch a YouTube video. That's buffer load. So as it turns out, the way BitTorrent was working, it didn't have good understanding of how to limit packets that it's sending. It didn't actually have good fairness, and it's not entirely a buffer bloat issue, but it looks similar. And for some people running Bitcoin clients on very large buffered networks, and especially low uplink bandwidth networks, they see similar issues. What happens in Bitcoin is if you happen to get relayed a block before some of your other peers, so I know some people who were running the relay network client, which means they got blocks very quickly and their other peers did not, they would immediately try to upload this block to all their peers, because all their peers hadn't seen the block. They would request it, and they would try to upload it to everyone. As it turns out, that fills your outbound buffer and fills any buffers you have in networking between your host and the other servers, and all of a sudden, your outbound buffer is packed, and anytime you go to load a YouTube video, you have to wait for that buffer to clear, and it takes forever. So, bandwidth is a real problem for some people in the peer-to-peer network when we find blocks, because we're uploading a decent chunk of data at a time to a bunch of peers. Again, we already have a mempool with transactions. We already have most of the transactions that are going to be in the block locally available. We know what they're going to be. Why do we have to relay them again? So the goal, we want to communicate compressed representation of which transactions we need from the other to complete the block as quickly in a small amount of space as possible, preferably as quickly as possible. And there's two kind of approaches I'm sure most of you are aware of, both compact blocks and extend, which try it in very different ways, but effectively accomplish the same result. There's some very significant difference in approach, but both of them try to accomplish the same thing of communicating a compressed representation of which transactions you need to complete the block and only downloading a smaller amount of data. The main difference, at least in terms of practical applications for people, is that there's this pre-computable issue for the compressed representations. So in the compressed representation, one possible attack for this kind of system is that you create transactions which will have the same compressed representation. In this case, it's some function of the hash of the transaction. For X then, it's the Bloom filters hash. You can attack that. For compact blocks, it's the SHA-256 of it's the transaction hash. If you can compute transactions which will conflict and have the same compact representation, then this whole step isn't going to work, and you're going to have to fall back to sending the full block. There's protections for this in compact blocks, so it's not possible. There aren't in Xthin, but hopefully they'll add those at some point, and then they will be largely similar for users. The last step that is happening in the peer-to-peer network in several different ways is to relay before full validation. Remember I mentioned that the peer-to-peer network tries very hard to validate everything before it relays it on, before it does any major processing of it, because it's good hygiene in network engineering or in general protocol engineering to do that. As it turns out, we don't really need to do that always for blocks, because blocks have this wonderful thing called proof of work. Turns out it's really hard to create a valid proof of work for some reason. And so we can just validate that and relay the block on. It's not a huge deal. It doesn't open us up to any major DOS attacks. And so that's also a big change. So these are some diagrams of compact blocks, which I happen to have available. This is the old scheme. Node A will receive the block, it'll validate it, it'll do all the normal checks, and then it'll go back and forth and eventually send the full block onto its peers. In kind of the initial compact block stuff, or in the low bandwidth mode, it receives the block, it does the full validation, and then it sends it the header, the normal thing, the normal stuff to announce the block, and then it will send this compact representation of the block, which is not very large, it's on the order of 2 kilobytes, and then it will send finally, if it needs to, which it often doesn't, any missing transactions that the node needs, and then they'll have the full block. In the kind of high bandwidth mode, we don't need to do the validation, and we can send the compact representation early, and then the node will receive the block much quicker. So as a result, the peer-to-peer network speeds up very significantly, but again, the primary motivation is bandwidth and maybe a bit less just speed. Alright, so finally I'm going to talk about fiber. So the fiber is a kind of complete reimagining of the relay network based on everything I've learned over a few years of working on it. It has much better compression because it uses compact blocks. In fact, compact blocks was written initially as a part of fiber and then later submitted to Bitcoin Core. Compact blocks does much better than the relay network because it's just kind of a better designed protocol in general, but additionally it has a full mempool, right? It's a full Bitcoin Core node with however large a mempool you want to have, which allows it to have better knowledge of potential transactions that might be in a block than the relay network, which is, again, a constant size set of transactions. It also has a goal of just being hopefully more decentralized. So the relay network is very heavily centralized, and while the source is open, and I've encouraged people to run secondary networks of the relay network so that there's multiple ones, that still hasn't happened. So fiber is designed to be just a thing that you add to your Bitcoin Core node, and you can add it to any of your existing peering relationships, anywhere where you already have 2 Bitcoin Core nodes that are talking to each other. You can switch them both to fiber, and it'll just work like normal, and it'll just be a whole lot faster to relay blocks. The final step to fiber, which is kind of the cool technological improvement, is that I completely ditched TCP. Right, so I talked about how TCP is kind of awful for this low latency work, where you have a small amount of data that you want to transmit very quickly, and switch to a technology called forward error correction. So forward error correction is something that has had a lot of academic research over the years, primarily for use in VoIP stuff. So your Skype, your whatever, again, it's a similar problem where you care about, you want low latency communication, and you care about it getting to the other end, but you really care about this low latency issue. And oftentimes, again, you're talking across the globe. TCP is really bad for this, and so what you do is you essentially do what this diagram shows, and you start with a set of packets, right? You start with the data that you want to send, and you're going to do some fancy, well, actually not so fancy linear algebra, and add some additional data that you can send, and then some stuff is going to get dropped along the way, because that's how the internet works, but it doesn't really matter, you can still reconstruct it. As long as you have at least the number of packets that you initially wanted to send, and the math isn't perfect for fast encodings of this, so at least a few more, you can still reconstruct the final data no matter which packets were dropped. So there's, a simple example of this, if you just want one extra block, is you XOR all of the blocks together, and then if you lose one block, it doesn't matter which one you lost, you can reconstruct the final block, because remember, XOR is commutative, and you can just XOR all the things you have, and you'll have the one missing block. Obviously, the math is a bit more complicated if you want to be able to use more than one packet, but it turns out it's not too bad in terms of linear algebra. So Fiber works by doing this, so it takes the compact block representations of the block, and encodes them using FEC, sends it all over UDP, loses a bunch of packets, but it's not a big deal, and in the end, it can reconstruct the block. So I've tested this on a network of relatively cheap virtual servers. Virtual servers, as it turns out, have very significant latency spikes, so this is maybe not so representative, but this is a graph of the percentile. So the percentile is here on the bottom, up to the 100th percentile, and this is the amount of time taken in excess of the speed of light. So all the way down here, this is, it took 1 millisecond longer than the speed of light to relay the block. And some numbers here is, at about 50%, right here, it's 20 milliseconds, or about 20 milliseconds, so half of the time it relays the block in only 20 milliseconds more than the speed of light through fiber. Speed of light through fiber is really slow, but the speed of light through physical fiber, glass fiber is really slow. At the 80th percentile, it's around 50 milliseconds. So 80% of the time, it takes no more than 50 milliseconds in excess of the speed of light to relay the block. And this does not add up across hops. So if you have server A connected to server B connected to server C, this is not additive. This is how long it will take to get from A to C through B. It doesn't really matter how many hops you have in between. Okay, so yeah, that's what I've got prepared. Feel free to ask questions about this or any other topic. Perfectly willing to answer anything you may have.
Thank you.
So, some questions? Okay, I will start with the first one, as always. So, first question, very stupid one. What do you mean adding microseconds to a speed? You mean microsecond per unit of length, or?
No, sorry. No, total milliseconds, right? So
In an average,
sorry. So from the first from the time first node receives the block to the time that other nodes receive the block, it took the speed of light plus 10 or 20 or 50 milliseconds.
Yeah. Choosing random nodes.
No, sorry. This is across my own network.
Okay,
from the first one to the last one.
And
you take the distance,
from the
time is, and then
so from the first node, it was in a network that looks very similar to this. It's not the same network, but a similar one on relatively cheap virtual servers. From the time the first node saw it to the time any other node saw it, and count each of them the same, it took the distance that it takes light to travel through the fiber, plus 10, 20, 50 milliseconds to get the block all the way to the other side, and everywhere around the globe.
Thanks. And the
Second question is, speaking about centralization and censorship capabilities, how is the fiber different from the relay network? Are there some improvement? Maybe some. Are you thinking about some store like the distribution? I don't know. What are you going to do about that?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean the main aspect of decentralization that changes with fiber is that I don't intend to run a network that's public. It's currently helping the relay network be a bit faster, but I have several people who are going to run additional fiber networks, so public networks running fiber, and additionally, I have talked to a bunch of miners who have nodes, and they will switch those nodes to running fiber is just a little add-on to Bitcoin Core. They will switch those nodes to running fiber between their nodes so that they have fast relay between their blocks. A second answer to this is actually really interesting. Sadly, because of the way fiber works, you can't simply add nodes to a fiber network and still have the same speed. The issue is that when you get a packet in fiber, you immediately forward it on to other nodes. So this is why the speed is not additive. You don't add additional time to go across more nodes. Which is obviously really important for the speed around the globe when you have a bunch of nodes, but you can't do that without trusting the other side. So just because of the way Bitcoin works, right, there's no way for you to know that this random packet of data, which seems to be from a block, corresponds to something that actually has a valid proof of work. There were actually some researchers who did a similar network and built it so that a part of the block header commits to all of the individual packets that you would send in a forward error correction scheme. And if you did this, then you would be able to build a completely peer-to-peer network based on fiber that would be incredibly fast and would be just about as optimal as you could get building a completely random peer-to-peer network for fast relay. But this would require it would be not very invasive, but a pretty aggressive soft fork to Bitcoin, because you would be requiring miners to do a bunch of additional pre-computation that they would commit to in their block header, which would be pretty expensive.
So, other questions? If you are okay.
To get the measure of excess of the speed of light between nodes, is an issue to have a perfect timestamp between server, or it's like just NTP to sync?
Yeah, so you certainly can NTP. For those who've ever tried to deal with time on the internet, you know that time on the internet is absolutely awful. You have no reasonable assumption that any server on the internet is more than a minute within the correct time. It's in fact very, very difficult to get good timing info on the internet. So actually the way I measured that instead, I did a bunch of work to ensure that the first packet for a given block will go out immediately when you receive the block, and then I just cheated, and on each server I measured the time between the first packet and the time that I had reconstructed the full block, and used that as the measurement here. So it's actually the amount of time between the first packet that made it all the way through the network and through the routers and through the speed of light to the time that we reconstructed the block. So this essentially measures all of the various processing time in fiber, as well as the difference in latency between packets on the internet, which, again, the internet's an awful, awful place, and it's really not uncommon to have a server and ping a server that's like halfway across the city, and the ping will be bimodal. So it'll have half of the ping times will be 1 millisecond, and half of the ping times will be literally 100 milliseconds. I'm not joking. I've seen servers that do this. It's insane. The internet's ridiculous.
I didn't actually have a question. I was wondering who was the other network, the one that requires miners to do some work beforehand and that requires the software. Is that Cirrus?
That sounds like a question.
Well,
yeah, that does sound like a question. No, that was a research topic for them. I don't think they proposed it as even a fork on a public network. They were more targeting what is the absolute best case for performance and throughput of a private blockchain, just as a test to see how quickly they could get throughput. And this was the scheme they used to get the fastest possible throughput of block speed. Okay.
Thanks. Other questions?
I actually have a question about, going back to basics. When you were talking about selfish mining, how is it so different from selfish mining from a 51% attack?
Thanks. That's a really good question. A lot of people think they're the same thing. So the basic difference is that selfish mining attack. In the selfish mining attack, you pay attention, and when you see if you have never found any of these, and the rest of the network finds this block, then you will start mining on this block, because otherwise you'll be behind. And this is the reason why you'll never get 100% of the blocks, because sometimes the network will find blocks, and you will not have found anything, and in fact, more probably because you don't have 51%, and as a result, you'll jump to using their blocks. In a 51% attack, you completely ignore the rest of the network, and you just mine all of the blocks, and because you have more than 50% in the long term, you will have a longer chain.
So, is it right to tell that 51% attack assumes a selfish network when you have 51%?
I mean, it's a similar principle, right, in that you're selfishly mining all of the blocks, but in specifically the selfish mining attack, you're still paying attention to the rest of the network, whereas in a 51% attack, you completely ignore it, and you just mine your own chain, and the network will follow you because you're going to be longer.
Questions? There. So, if you're okay with that, Matt, we can also maybe get to a larger scope of questions. If you have some questions about the other work.
Okay. What is the roadmap of deployment of fiber at what point you are? What are the plan of embedding it in Bitcoin Core and everything?
Yeah, so Bitcoin Core has this really annoying thing called a review process. Bitcoin Core tends to be really insistent on carefully reviewing your code and making sure there's no major security flaws.
I'm sorry.
It's mostly his fault, he does a bunch of it. So in terms of getting it integrated in Bitcoin Core, I think that would be a nice step in the long run, but I don't really have the time to make that happen in the short term. Luckily, the way Fiber is designed, right, it is a fast relay mechanism, which means if you run it on a separate node that's not, say, your mining node, it's not a big deal if it crashes, it just means your block relay is getting a bit slower and you can fix the problem, it's not the end of the world. So that's kind of the state of it. It's incredibly stable in my testing. My nodes haven't crashed in a long time, but I'm perfectly willing to assume that there are probably some security holes or something, and there's probably some bugs where you can cause it to crash. As for deploying networks, there's a few folks who said they intend to deploy networks based on it and make them publicly available for fast relay. None of them have gotten around to it yet, in part because I haven't followed up, haven't had time to follow up with them. But I anticipate that to happen, within the next few months.
And another question. Maybe it's a stupid question, but do you need to be a miner to run a Fiber server, or you could just set in one app just to help the network? So
again, right, the peer-to-peer network is random, so if you happen to improve relay between two random points on the peer-to-peer network, right, if you have a bunch of nodes randomly in the peer-to-peer network, and you improve relay between them, you can very often make a difference in the speed of the overall peer-to-peer network. Still, there's not a ton of use in doing so because there are a number of such networks, so primarily it's targeted at miners and people who need fast relay, which turns out to pretty much just be miners. Right? If you're a merchant, you get a block 2 seconds late, it's not a big deal. If you're a miner and you get a block 2 seconds late, that can actually be a very significant amount of your profit. So.
Yeah. Okay.
So based on your statement that it's not additive, the gain in speed if you just multiply the nodes, is there a strong network effect to join the same fiber network, or I can just clone the network and do another one without any significant loss in network effect?
So there's kind of two questions. Let me pick two questions out of there. So the question of, if you're running your own fiber network, can you just add more nodes and it'll be additive in terms of will it be helpful? Up to a limit, the answer is yes. Obviously, you only have a certain amount of outbound bandwidth. You have, roughly a gigabit per second of outbound bandwidth. So if you have to spend more time sending it around to different nodes, then potentially this can start to slow you down on the whole. But up to a point, yes. So if you have a few extra nodes, it's probably a good thing because you'll have more redundancy, which means more reliability. The packets will take a faster path. Then independently, the question of kind of is it additive to add more fiber networks, more independent networks? Absolutely, yes. More of these networks, again, is more decentralized, right? If we start with the assumption that you can't necessarily, or you can't reasonably build an incredibly fast peer-to-peer network, or an incredibly fast, highly decentralized network, then having mini centralized networks is the best alternative, because if 1 or 5 networks decide to censor your blocks, you still have a fast way of getting your blocks.
If you think about it a bit and assume that there were 2 independent fiber networks operated by 2 independent parties, and in one point, so there's no intersection in what the actual nodes on these networks are, but 2 of them happen to be close together in terms of network topology. They happen to be in the same city. Now your overall maximum speed across the network, even across those 2, is going to be the speed of light plus the time that the fiber network has, plus 1 hop between them. So this probably still helps the network overall by having 2 fiber networks close to each other. Feel free to disagree with me if you.
I mean, marginal improvement is improvement.
Question?
So,
Fast, because otherwise the
in a way, this kind of solution, are they really neutral to the centralization of the network? I mean, singling out in a dedicated network the mining nodes might be some, might worry for some weakness, like pointing them out, or they are already pointed out in some way, maybe. I don't know.
privacy.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of centralization aspects to this, right? As to your specific point about learning where mining nodes are, a number of kind of Bitcoin Relay Network users choose to select a node that is nearby, but in a different data center, maybe across the city, to run their Relay Network client so that it doesn't expose where their actual node is while still being very fast. It is generally not the case that you can reasonably DDoS an entire city offline, especially not one with good connectivity. So while you could DDoS an individual server, it wouldn't really help you. It would just prevent them from connecting to the relay network. This is something that I've encouraged people to do, although not necessarily all of them have done it. So there are some ways to mitigate that as a miner, right? And there are, in fact, pretty effective ways to mitigate that. Even still, right, redundancy is your best bet with a miner to begin with. So many large miners obviously have redundant internet connections, multiple connections, and might keep one private while one is more public. There's a lot of ways to mitigate that particular issue. As for this being positive or negative on centralization on the whole, well, I mean, that's up to you, right? centralization is this weird thing in Bitcoin, or decentralization is this weird thing in Bitcoin, right? Because decentralization doesn't provide you anything. Decentralization provides specific features, like it makes for much better fungibility because it provides anti-censorship features, it provides better reliability because the peer-to-peer network is more resilient to individual servers being shut down. It provides a lot of things, but it isn't kind of in itself a feature. So, you know, does this make the network more centralized? Sure, of course. Does this make Bitcoin more decentralized, or at least have better these kind of properties that result from centralization? I would argue yes, because it works to make selfish mining attacks harder. It works to improve the access of smaller miners to fast relay technologies. Right? If you're a small miner and you want to get into solo mining, or you want to get into P2Pool mining or something like that, but you don't want your blocks to transit this crazy mess, because you want your blocks to transit quickly to other miners, then having a network like this available, even if it's centralized, is a big win for you. So I would argue that this improves the decentralization properties of Bitcoin that really matter, like the decentralization of mining, very significantly, even if it means the network itself, or the block relay mechanism, is more centralized.
I just spread the topic a little bit. Are there other kind of solution from different direction to the selfish mining problem, or to the centralization of mining problem more generally, like the delegation of proof? I mean, more generally, what are for you the hot topics about reducing potentials for mining centralization?
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole other question, right? Obviously, mining centralization is a big worry of mine because I've spent a lot of time working on Relay to mitigate it. But mining centralization is a whole lot more than that. It's you know, I mean, I don't have the graph up, but right, there's like 3 pools, and between the 3 of them, it's like 60% of hash rate. That's really significant. That's a potentially significant problem in that they can perform attacks, and certainly in the short term, before people have a chance to react, they will be able to potentially rip off people with various double spending attacks, and etc., which is not good for the system. As for ways of decentralizing mining, I mean, I think better relay is an important first step in the ability of people to run mining more locally, to run systems like P2Pool, to run systems where they have to relay the block. I think generally it's interesting when you look at the mining ecosystem. It tends to be pretty decentralized when it comes to hashing. As it turns out, the global energy markets are pretty decentralized because it's fairly difficult for you to get more than, say, a megawatt by showing up and saying, I want power, and it's fairly reasonable to get under a megawatt, under 500 kilowatts, sometimes a bit more, without needing to sign some special contract, and you can do that and get reasonably cheap power in a lot of places. The reason for this is that if you want a lot of power, normally you have to show up and sign a deal with some local politician, which, depending on where in the world you are, might mean corruption, but more likely, at least in the US, that means you have to show up with jobs. Bitcoin mining generally doesn't have many jobs. Generally, the job descriptions are like security guard and someone to walk around and unplug servers and plug them back in when they die. But sometimes you can merge those, so one job is not usually comparable to an entire factory of people working to make steel. So hashers are actually pretty decentralized. The people who actually have hash power, or where the hash power is very decentralized, and the people who own it is much more decentralized than kind of the hash rate distribution that you see among pools. But none of them, right, I mean, I wouldn't even want to set up, I certainly don't want to solo mine because of variance, and don't want to spend the time to set up all of the infrastructure, even if I were a reasonably sized miner, say, 5% of the hash rate or something. It's still a lot of work to set up Bitcoin Core and optimize it and connect to the relay network and build out your own fiber network, build out your own fast relay networks. So it's a lot of work to do that, and I think it's important that people work on improving that, that kind of the amount of effort that it takes there. I know there's been at least one company that tried to kind of make it very easy. It's kind of like, here, take this box, plug it in, and then point all your miners at it. This is kind of your pool server. And then there's also a bunch of technologies that will allow you to split the reward, kind of like P2Pool, without having to have the pool select the transaction. So I think P2Pool, but a bit more centralized. It doesn't have kind of all of the intricacies of P2Pool being a pretty complex system. It's something that's hard to run, or reasonably hard to run, and something that is not particularly well maintained anymore. I think Forest kind of disappeared. But there's a lot of alternatives that look similar or have at least a similar effect in that the kind of actual hasher is the one doing the transaction selection, and then the miner or the pool is only splitting the reward to remove variance. And in such schemes, you need things like fast relay networks, you need or the peer-to-peer network to be faster or whatever, because the individuals are going to have to be forwarding blocks. So I think this is an important step, and hopefully we'll see more work go into kind of allowing the hashers or the people who have the hash power on the ground to actually be the people selecting transactions, selecting previous blocks, and doing the actual mining and pool collaborating.
Last questions, I would say. If not, okay. So thank you. Oh.
Why are you hard? I was checking something on the internet, but I did not have time. If I remember correctly, the latency of fiber channel is like 2/3 of the speed of light of the packet. So could be that like a private infrastructure with I don't know, radio channels between continents be like a source of centralization in some way.
Yes, absolutely. So you see this in the high-frequency trading industry. The high-frequency trading industry has or for those who are unaware, first of all, you pointed out correctly that the speed of light through a glass fiber is pretty slow. It's on the order of 1.8 times the speed of light through a vacuum, which is roughly similar to the speed of light through air. As it turns out, radio waves travel at pretty much the speed of light. So the high-frequency trading industry, which has a similar effect, but even more extreme one, where if you were the first person to get 1 bit or a small amount of data across the wire to another city, you can make a lot of money. They have, for example, a microwave relay network with just towers along the distance between Chicago and New York. And in fact, they just completed one between New York and London across the Arctic Circle, up over the Arctic, where there's actually somewhere where you can build a tower. And this is 2 milliseconds faster than the fiber that takes a much more direct route. And they spent a ton of money to set microwave relay networks, or microwave towers, leave their microwave towers all the way up over the Arctic to get to London 2 milliseconds faster so that they can make a lot of money. So this is a potential area for centralization. As it has turned out in the HFT industry, what most of them have done is someone owns that tower route and they sell the bandwidth instead of being the one to monopolize it. But if someone were to do this in Bitcoin, they could potentially have a 2 millisecond advantage, or more between New York and Chicago, or more if they built it along longer routes that other people wouldn't have. So yeah, that's a potential area of centralization, but a very expensive. Miners have to spend a lot of money to do something like that.
When Bitcoin destroys the financial industry, they can switch the towers to do this. Okay, so again, thank you very much.
Are we sure? Yeah. The winner is Francesco! Yeah. Francesco Nacchia. Ah, no, ma
I'm coming!
Yeah, please come in. This is your moment, please come!
Allora volevo scattare, invece sì, non avevo capito. Perché sai che...
Adesso facciamo una foto di gruppo e poi andiamo.
So, thank you for participating. This is your last round.
You are out of the camera, please.
No!
It seems you wins me, but...
I win also the girl.
No, you didn't win me. I'm not Sorry.
Ciao.
Say hello.
So I think it's time for...
Facciamo una foto?
Facciamo foto di gruppo, dai.
Ok, foto...